close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. It is the early morning of May 29th in the year 1453. A cool wind drifts across the ancient stone walls of Constantinople. The sky is still dark blue, that quiet color that comes just before sunrise. From the top of the massive city walls, a tired soldier looks out across the land. What he sees is almost impossible to believe. Tens of thousands of enemy tents stretch across the fields like an endless sea. Small fires flicker in the darkness. Horses shift restlessly. Somewhere far away, a deep drum echoes through the Ottoman camp. An army is waiting, and inside the city, people already know something terrible is about to happen. Because this will not just be another battle. This morning will decide the fate of an empire that has existed for more than 1,100 years. Before we step deeper into this story together, take a quick moment to support the journey. If you enjoy calm historical stories like this one, you can gently tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, or leave a comment below. I always enjoy hearing where in the world you are listening from. Maybe you are watching late at night in a quiet room, or perhaps during a calm afternoon somewhere across the ocean. Either way, I am glad you are here. Now settle in, take a slow breath, and let us travel back to one of the most dramatic mornings in human history. Constantinople was not just another medieval city. For centuries, it had been known as the greatest fortress on earth. Founded in the year 330 by Emperor Constantine, the city stood at one of the most important crossroads in the world. Europe met Asia here. Merchants carried silk from China, spices from India, and precious goods from across the Mediterranean. And protecting this magnificent city were the legendary Theodosian walls. These walls were not ordinary defenses. They were a massive system of stone fortifications, nearly 5 kilometers long, built with multiple layers of walls and towers. For more than 1,000 years, invading armies had tried to break through them, and almost all had failed. The Persians could not do it. The Arabs could not do it. Even powerful medieval armies had turned away after staring up at those enormous walls. Many people believed Constantinople was simply impossible to conquer. But by the year 1453, the mighty Byzantine Empire had become only a shadow of its former self. At its peak, this empire had ruled lands stretching across the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of Europe. Now it had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. Inside Constantinople lived perhaps 50,000 people, and defending the city were only about 7,000 soldiers. 7,000 men standing against an army that was many times larger. Their leader was Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium. He was not a man known for luxury or grand ceremonies. By this time, there was little wealth left in the empire anyway. Instead, Constantine XI had something more important: determination. Historical accounts tell us that he often walked along the walls himself, speaking directly with soldiers and citizens. He knew every man defending the city understood the truth. If Constantinople fell, the Byzantine Empire would disappear forever. Meanwhile, outside those legendary walls stood a young ruler who had been dreaming about this moment for years. His name was Sultan Mehmed II, and he was only 21 years old. To many people in Europe at the time, that might have sounded almost unbelievable. A 21-year-old leading one of the most powerful armies in the world. But Mehmed was not ordinary. Since childhood, he had studied maps of Constantinople. He had read the history of the Roman and Byzantine empires. He knew that conquering this city would not just be a military victory. It would change the balance of power between Europe and the rising Ottoman Empire. So he prepared carefully. He gathered an enormous army, possibly close to 100,000 soldiers. Among them were elite janissaries, trained warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for war. And Mehmed brought something that previous armies did not have: new weapons powered by gunpowder. One enormous cannon, designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, was capable of firing gigantic stone balls that shook the earth when they landed. For the first time in history, The walls of Constantinople faced a technology powerful enough to crack them open. And so the stage was set. Inside the city stood the last defenders of an empire more than 1,000 years old. Outside the walls waited a young sultan with ambition, patience, and an army unlike any the city had faced before. The siege had already begun weeks earlier, and every sunrise since then had brought the thunder of cannons and the sound of stone collapsing. But the most dramatic moments were still ahead, because the young Ottoman ruler was about to attempt one of the most surprising military moves of the entire Middle Ages, a strategy so unusual that when the defenders first saw it happen, many of them could hardly believe their eyes. And that moment begins the next chapter of our story. And while the cannons continued to shake the ancient walls day after day, Sultan Mehmed II realized something frustrating. The city still would not fall. Yes, the giant cannons were damaging the defenses. Massive stones crashed into the Theodosian walls, sending dust and broken blocks tumbling down. Contemporary chroniclers, such as the Byzantine historian George Francis, described how the ground itself seemed to tremble when the great bombards fired. But Constantinople was stubborn. Every night, while the Ottoman army rested, the defenders quietly repaired the damage. Citizens, monks, merchants, even children helped carry stones and rubble back to the walls. By sunrise, sections that had been shattered the day before were standing again. Imagine the exhaustion. Day after day of explosions, night after night of rebuilding, and yet the city kept resisting. So Mehmed began thinking differently. Instead of attacking only the walls, he decided to attack the city's lifeline. You see, Constantinople was not protected only by stone, it was also protected by water. To the north of the city lay the Golden Horn, a long, narrow harbor that functioned like a natural shield. The Byzantines had stretched an enormous iron chain across the entrance of this harbor, preventing enemy ships from sailing inside. This chain had worked for centuries. In fact, during earlier sieges, enemy fleets simply gave up once they saw it. Without control of the harbor surrounding the city completely was nearly impossible. But Mehmed had an idea that sounded almost crazy. Instead of trying to break the chain, what if he simply went around it? One night in April of 1453, Ottoman engineers began preparing an operation that historians still talk about with amazement. They built a road made of wooden planks and greased logs across the hills behind the city. Then, under the cover of darkness, they started pulling ships over land. Yes, actual warships. According to several contemporary sources, including the historian Kritovolos, more than 70 Ottoman vessels were dragged across roughly 2 miles of hillside, using ropes, wooden rollers, and hundreds of soldiers and oxen. Imagine the scene: large wooden ships slowly sliding over the earth, men straining with ropes, torches flickering in the night, wood-creaking soldiers shouting commands, wheels grinding against greased timber, and all of this happening silently in the darkness, while the people inside Constantinople slept. By morning, something unbelievable appeared in the Golden Horn. Ottoman ships, right behind the city's defenses. When the defenders woke up and looked toward the harbor, they saw enemy sails where there had been none the night before. Just imagine being a Byzantine guard that morning. One day, the harbor is safe. The next day, the enemy fleet is already inside. Some accounts say panic spread quickly along the walls. The city was now surrounded not only on land, but also from the water. And suddenly, the psychological pressure on the defenders grew even heavier. Have you ever had that feeling when a problem you thought was impossible suddenly finds a way around your defenses? That was exactly what Constantinople experienced in that moment. But strangely enough, the city still did not collapse. Even after this shocking move, the defenders continued to fight with remarkable determination. Because by this point, everyone inside the walls understood something very clearly. They were not just defending a city. They were defending the last piece of an empire that had once called itself Rome. And as the days passed, the tension inside Constantinople grew thicker and heavier. Food was becoming scarce. The cannons kept firing. Ottoman troops prepared for something bigger, something final. And inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI was about to make one of the most emotional decisions of his life, a moment that would define how history remembers the last hours of the Byzantine Empire. As the siege tightened around Constantinople, something interesting began to happen inside the city walls. The people slowly realized that this might be the final chapter of their civilization, and instead of panic alone, many turned toward something deeper: faith, memory, and identity. In the final weeks of the siege, the city became strangely quiet at night. The cannons would stop for a few hours, and a different sound would fill the streets. Church bells. People gathered in ancient churches that had stood for centuries. Monks whispered prayers. Families lit candles. Soldiers who had spent the entire day repairing walls or preparing weapons suddenly stood silently beneath enormous stone domes. One of the most powerful moments happened inside the Hagia Sophia. This massive cathedral had been the spiritual heart of the Byzantine world since the year 537, when Emperor Justinian first opened its doors. For nearly 900 years, emperors were crowned there. Victories were celebrated there. Entire generations had walked beneath its golden mosaics. And now, during the final days of May, in the year 1453, something unusual happened. Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholics prayed together inside the same church. Now that may not sound dramatic at first, but historically it was extraordinary. These two branches of Christianity had been divided for centuries since the Great Schism of the year 1054. They disagreed about theology, authority, and traditions. But in the shadow of an approaching disaster, those arguments suddenly seemed very small. According to the historian Edward Gibbon and several Byzantine chroniclers, the final mass held in Hagia Sophia brought together soldiers, nobles, priests, and ordinary citizens. Some cried quietly, some prayed, some simply stood there in silence, perhaps wondering what the world would look like after the next sunrise. Imagine being there in that moment. The light of hundreds of candles reflecting off golden mosaics, the smell of incense drifting through the air, the echo of voices singing ancient hymns, and outside, somewhere beyond the walls, 100,000 enemy soldiers were preparing for the final assault. Do you think people inside the church knew the end was close? Many probably did. Meanwhile, Emperor Constantine XI was not hiding inside a palace. Historical sources describe him spending his last days moving constantly along the defensive lines. He met commanders, encouraged exhausted soldiers, and helped organize the final defenses. One of the key figures fighting beside him was a skilled Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani. He brought about 700 professional soldiers from Italy to help defend the walls. These men became some of the most important fighters during the siege, especially near the weakest section of the land walls, known as the Gate of St. Romanus. Day after day, they stood there facing artillery fire, arrows, and waves of attacks. But everyone involved could sense that the Ottoman army was preparing something bigger. Sultan Mehmed II had been patient for weeks. He studied the defenses. He tested different sections of the walls. And finally, he decided the time had come. According to several Ottoman and Byzantine accounts, on the evening of May 28th, the entire Ottoman camp became strangely active. Drums sounded. Torches lit the hills. Soldiers sharpened weapons and prepared ladders. Orders spread quietly through the ranks. A massive coordinated assault would begin before sunrise. Inside Constantinople, word of these preparations slowly reached the defenders. The final battle was approaching, and before the night ended, Emperor Constantine XI gathered his commanders and soldiers for one last speech, a moment that many historians believe was the emotional heart of the entire siege, because in just a few hours, history itself was about to change forever. Night slowly settled over Constantinople on the evening of May 28th in the year 1453. For the people inside the city, it was a strange kind of night, not completely silent, but not completely chaotic either. Torches flickered along the walls. Soldiers adjusted their armor. Priests moved quietly among small groups of defenders, offering blessings and whispered prayers. Somewhere in the distance, the Ottoman war drums continued beating in slow, steady rhythms, almost like a heartbeat echoing across the hills. Everyone understood what those drums meant. The final assault was coming. Earlier that evening, Emperor Constantine XI gathered his commanders and soldiers for what would become one of the most famous final speeches in history. According to several Byzantine chroniclers, including George Francis, the emperor spoke calmly but with deep emotion. He reminded them that they were defending more than stone walls. They were defending their families, their faith, their history, and perhaps most importantly, the legacy of a civilization that traced its roots back to ancient Rome. One line from accounts of the speech is often remembered. Constantine reportedly told his men that a good ruler must be willing to die for his people. Think about that for a moment. A ruler standing among soldiers fully aware that he might not survive the night. Would most leaders today do the same? The emperor then did something remarkable. Instead of retreating to safety, he took his position at the most dangerous part of the defense near the damaged section of the land walls, close to the gate of St. Romanus, right beside ordinary soldiers, right where the enemy would strike the hardest. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the Ottoman army prepared with incredible organization. Sultan Mehmed II had divided his forces into waves. First would come irregular troops, lightly equipped fighters meant to exhaust the defenders. Behind them would follow more disciplined Anatolian soldiers. And finally, the elite janissaries, the most highly trained warriors in the Ottoman Empire. The idea was simple but brutal. Each wave would weaken the defense a little more, until eventually something would break. Just before dawn on May 29th, the sky above Constantinople turned that deep blue color that appears moments before sunrise. Then the horns sounded. The Ottoman cannons fired again, shaking the ground. Drums thundered across the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers surged forward toward the walls, carrying ladders, shields, and banners. From the towers above, the defenders watched the enormous wave of humanity moving toward them. Imagine standing there. You are one of only a few thousand defenders, and an army many times larger is running directly toward your position. Would you stand your ground, or would fear take over? For a while, the defenders held remarkably well. The first waves of attackers struggled to climb the walls under heavy resistance. Arrows rained down. Stones were thrown. Gunfire echoed across the battlefield. But the fighting was fierce and chaotic. At one point during the battle, the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani was seriously wounded by either a cannon fragment or an arrow. Sources differ on the exact cause, but the effect was immediate. He was carried away from the battlefield, and when the soldiers near him saw their commander leaving, something dangerous happened. Morale began to crack, because in battles like this, sometimes the smallest moment can change everything. And in the growing chaos near the gate of St. Romanus, a single breach in the defenses was about to appear, a moment that would open the door to the end of Constantinople itself. And when that breach finally happened, the fate of an empire that had lasted more than 1,100 years would be decided within minutes. And then, in the middle of the chaos, it finally happened. A small opening appeared in the defenses of Constantinople, not a dramatic explosion that destroyed the entire wall in one moment. History is often less cinematic than that. Instead, it was something more subtle and perhaps more terrifying, a weakness. Near the heavily damaged section of the wall close to the gate of St. Romanus, the defenders were already exhausted. Weeks of cannon fire had cracked parts of the structure, and the continuous assaults had drained the soldiers who were trying to hold the line. Then something unexpected occurred. According to several historical accounts, including the writings of the Byzantine historian Ducas, a small postern gate known as the Kirkoporta may have been left open or improperly secured during the confusion of battle. Through that narrow entrance, a group of Ottoman soldiers managed to slip inside the outer defenses. At first, almost no one noticed. Imagine that moment. Thousands of men are fighting along the walls. Arrows are flying. Cannons are firing. Soldiers are shouting in multiple languages. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a few enemy soldiers suddenly appear inside the defensive perimeter. Once they realized what had happened, those soldiers reportedly climbed one of the nearby towers and raised the Ottoman banner. From the outside, the attacking army saw something astonishing. Their flag inside the walls, and that changed everything. The sight electrified the Ottoman troops and terrified many of the defenders. Suddenly, the psychological balance of the battle shifted. Around the same time, the wounded commander Giovanni Giustiniani had already been carried away from the battlefield. His departure created confusion among the defenders near the most critical point of the wall. Without their experienced leader, coordination began to break down. Meanwhile, Sultan Mehmed II launched his final wave. The Janissaries, these elite soldiers, were disciplined, highly trained, and determined to finish the assault. Wave after wave pushed toward the weakened section of the wall. Slowly, the defenders were pushed back. Emperor Constantine XI was still there, fighting alongside his soldiers. Several chroniclers describe him refusing to retreat, even when the situation became hopeless. At one point, realizing the city was lost, he is believed to have removed the imperial symbols from his armor so that he would not be recognized as emperor. He wanted to fight simply as another soldier. Think about that decision. A ruler who had every reason to escape, choosing instead to stay and face the same danger as everyone else. What would you have done in that moment? Historical records do not give us a perfectly clear description of the emperor's final minutes. What most historians agree on is that Constantine XI died during the fighting as Ottoman forces flooded into the city. And with his death, something extraordinary came to an end. The Byzantine Empire, an empire that had survived for more than 1,100 years, longer than almost any other civilization in European history. Yet in the middle of the battle, many people inside the city probably did not immediately realize what had just happened. Because while the walls had finally fallen, the story of Constantinople was not finished yet. The streets, the churches, and the ancient buildings of the city were about to witness one of the most dramatic transformations in world history. And so, as the Ottoman soldiers pushed deeper into the city, the story of Constantinople entered its final and most dramatic chapter. The morning sun slowly rose over the skyline, casting a golden light across towers, domes, and narrow streets that had existed for more than 1,000 years. But on that morning, everything was changing. When the Ottoman army finally broke through the defenses, chaos spread quickly through the city. Soldiers moved through the streets, banners flying, shouting victory. Some citizens fled toward churches, hoping to find safety. Others simply hid in their homes, unsure what the next hours would bring. One of the most famous places where many people gathered was the Hagia Sophia. For centuries, this enormous cathedral had symbolized the spiritual heart of the Byzantine world. According to several historical accounts, including those recorded by the historian Ducas, many residents believed the massive church might somehow protect them. Thousands gathered inside. Families, priests, children, elderly citizens. They prayed, they waited. But history rarely pauses for hope alone. Soon Ottoman soldiers entered the building, and the last great cathedral of Byzantium became part of a new chapter of history. Sultan Mehmed II himself entered Constantinople later that same day. By most historical accounts, he rode through the city, carefully observing the streets and the ancient buildings that had fascinated him since childhood. One story, described by Ottoman chroniclers and later historians, says that when Mehmed finally entered Hagia Sophia, he paused for a moment and looked up at its massive dome. Imagine that scene, a 21-year-old conqueror standing inside one of the greatest architectural wonders on earth. The empire that had ruled here for centuries was gone, and yet the city itself remained. Mehmed quickly made an important decision. Hagia Sophia would be converted into a mosque, but the building itself would be preserved. This choice helped ensure that the structure survived the centuries that followed. In many ways, the fall of Constantinople did not simply mark an ending. It marked the beginning of something new. The city soon became the capital of the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. Over the next centuries, it would grow into one of the largest and most influential cities in the world, eventually known as Istanbul. Historians often point out that the fall of Constantinople also changed the course of global history. Many scholars from the Byzantine world fled westward, bringing ancient Greek and Roman texts with them. Some historians believe this movement helped fuel the intellectual revival known as the Renaissance in Europe. Trade routes between Europe and Asia were also disrupted, pushing European explorers to search for new sea routes, and that search eventually helped lead to the Great Age of Exploration. So when we look back at the morning of May 29th, in the year 1453, we are not just looking at the fall of a city. We are looking at a moment when one world ended and another began. An empire that had survived wars, plagues, and centuries of change finally reached its final page. Yet its influence never truly disappeared. The architecture, the knowledge, the traditions, and the stories of Byzantium continued to shape the world long after the walls of Constantinople had fallen. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of history. Even when a civilization disappears, its ideas often keep traveling forward through time. Now, I am curious to hear your thoughts. If you had lived inside Constantinople during those final days, what do you think you would have done? Would you have defended the walls gathered inside the churches, or tried to escape the city before the final battle? History always feels distant until we imagine ourselves standing inside it. Thank you for spending this journey through history with me. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like the video or subscribe if you would like to hear more fascinating stories from the past. And when you are ready, there are many more incredible moments in history waiting for us to explore together in the next story.